Yes, the title is somewhat unusual, and the first part didn't fit up here. It's Goodbye to Mr. Potsnap. Not everybody present will be familiar with Mr. Potsnap, so I will briefly introduce this gentleman. His date of birth is unknown, and his death can only be presumed from the fact that he was middle-aged in 1865. And this is what our main source tells us about Mr. Potsnap. Mr. Potsnap was well-to-do and stood very high in Mr. Potsnap's opinion. Beginning with a good inheritance, he had married a good inheritance and had thriven exceedingly in the marine insurance way and was quite satisfied. The same source provides the following information about Mr. Potsnap's views on the world. Mr. Potsnap's world was not a very large world. No, not even geographically, seeing that although his business was sustained upon commerce with other countries, he considered other countries, without important reservation, a mistake, and of their manners and customs would conclusively observe, not English. Mr. Potsnap's importance for our topic, however, relates to his views on the British Constitution, as evidenced in the following conversation, which Mr. Potsnap carried on with a foreign gentleman. We Englishmen are very proud of our Constitution, sir. It was bestowed upon us by Providence. No other country is so favoured as this country. And other countries, said the foreign gentleman, they do how? They do, sir, returned Mr. Potsnap, gravely shaking his head. They do, I am sorry to oblige to say it, as they do. So Mr. Potsnap gives us an early, perhaps surprising example of constitutional patriotism, about 100 years before the word Verfassungspatriotismus was invented. Persistent doubts as to whether Britain had such a thing as a constitution in the first place have left Mr. Potsnap untouched. At least, this is what Charles Dickens tells us about Mr. Potsnap's views, and although that makes Mr. Potsnap a literary character rather than a real person, this can serve as a starting point for a short presentation on the relationship between British politics and British constitution. Because at Mr. Potsnap's times and until rather recently, the constitutional agenda in Britain was dominated by politics. And also, until rather recently, the majority in Britain would agree with Mr. Potsnap that this was all the better. If we ignore politics and political pressures for a moment and just concentrate on the law, that is, all rules which are binding and which can be enforced by a court of law, Britain was, and to a certain degree remains, a constitutional monarchy with a strong monarch, a monarch who at will can veto any legislation, who at leisure can appoint and then dismiss any person as prime minister or other minister, a monarch who has the right to dissolve at any time the lower house of parliament by calling a general election, a monarch who can freely appoint members to the upper house of parliament, and who likewise can also appoint judges. The control on these powers of the monarch remain purely political. There is a strong convention that the monarch will do nothing of this sort. The monarch will give assent to any legislation passed in parliament. The monarch will appoint as prime minister the leader of the party which has a majority in the House of Commons. The monarch will appoint any minister which the prime minister suggests for appointment. The monarch will dissolve the House of Commons for fresh elections if and only if the prime minister asks for it. The monarch will appoint to the House of Lords largely those persons whom the prime minister suggests for appointment. And the monarch will appoint as judges those persons who have emerged from an appointment procedure and are suggested by the prime minister or the Lord Chancellor. The key to the striking difference between law and politics are these conventions. These conventions are non-enforceable political rules which have emerged in practice. And over the last 300 years they have shifted nearly all the powers away from the monarch into the hands of the prime minister. And unlike previously the monarch, the prime minister usually, although not presently, enjoys a built-in majority in the House of Commons. That is so because the United Kingdom electoral system will usually, but not presently, provide the winner of a general election with a comfortable majority in the House of Commons. And the Prime Minister's majority is largely unhampered by a very weak House of Lords, which can at best delay but not prevent legislation. This combination of all the powers of a monarch with a usually safe majority in Parliament has arguably made the British Prime Minister the most powerful democratically elected politician worldwide. It's not just the absence of coalition partners who must be kept happy and whose ministers the head of government is not free to appoint or dismiss. It is also the absence of a constitutional court, the absence of any serious resistance in the second chamber of Parliament, and the traditional absence of regional governments and parliaments who want to share the power, which have traditionally made the Prime Minister such a powerful political figure. True, this must be seen in contrast to the relative might of the United Kingdom, and on that analysis the President of the United States will certainly be more powerful. But as we have seen again and are seeing again now, the chief weakness of the US President is that he, until this date only he, cannot rely on a majority in Congress, not even if the President's political party has a majority in both houses. There is a US Supreme Court, which can be very unruly and certainly is unpredictable. There are 50 states who jealously guard and defend their own legislative, executive, and judicative competences. Whenever I see Forbes putting up a list of the most powerful 100 people in the world, or the most powerful 100 politicians in the world, and Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, ranks above the British Prime Minister, I just wonder how they arrive at these figures. Because it's plainly not right if you compare the two. If you compare the powers of the German Chancellor with that of the British Prime Minister, even if Germany is a little larger and is economically at this moment, although not always, a little better off, this just cannot be right. Lord Hailsham, who was a conservative frontline politician, once famously called the UK constitutional system an elective dictatorship. You elect a dictator for up to 5 years, and then the dictator has to go, and then you elect a fresh dictator. This elective dictatorship, you may gather as much as two chief components. The first is called a fusion of executive and legislative powers. All government ministers, and they are numerous, are members of Parliament. If you count all together the ministers and those who serve ministerial functions in various departments, you arrive at a figure of about 100 people who are directly under the Prime Minister's control because he can dismiss them any time from this position. The Prime Minister, as a party leader, which the Prime Minister always is, can threaten rebelling backbenchers in many ways, if need, by ensuring that they will not be nominated for re-election, and also has the power to call for a snap election at any moment. You have to remember that. That's the one component, a fusion of executive and legislative. There is really a one joint power block. The separation is not strong at all. The second component is called the supremacy of Parliament. The United Kingdom Parliament is not hindered by any codified constitution, which the United Kingdom famously does not possess. The other two countries are Israel and New Zealand, and everybody else has a codified constitution. Any law can be enacted on any subject with any content at any time. No constitutional court will scrutinize acts of Parliament, let alone invalidate them for non-conformity with the Constitution. As to checks and balances, the balances do not exist, and the checks are exercised by the electorate. 5 years later, you will get the bill if you have done something wrong, at the latest. And this is the view of the UK Constitution, which has dominated Mr. Potsnap's times, the 19th century, and also the 20th century. It made Mr. Potsnap proud and happy. Foreign observers may be puzzled with his sentiments and why they should for so long have been shared by so many people in Britain. They have for long mainly seen the advantages of this politically dominated constitution: clear responsibilities, clear accountability, very stable governments. But all this may be a thing of the past. Over the last 14 years, since Labour under Tony Blair won the general election of 1997, we have seen a paradigmatic change in the relationship between constitution and politics in the United Kingdom. The elective dictator, the Prime Minister, has been losing power, and political checks have been giving way to constitutional checks and balances. We have in particular witnessed a shift from central government to the periphery in the form of devolution in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. We have seen a shift from government to the people through the increased use of referenda. We have seen a shift from parliament to the judiciary through the Human Rights Act. Professor Vernon Bogdanov, arguably the most eminent academic in his field, has summed up these dramatic changes in the title of a book which appeared in 2009 entitled The New British Constitution. Vernon Bogdanov will speak at the Centre for British Studies on 6 June at 6 p.m. Easy to remember, 666, in Mohrenstraße 60, a public lecture which we have co-organized with the Deutsch-Britische Gesellschaft, and to which everybody present is most cordially invited. This change does not end with 2009 and Bogdanov's book. I would add to this list a shift from government to the media through the Freedom of Information Act. 2 shifts from government to parliament have been announced to be introduced by future legislation, which would remove the power of the Prime Minister to call snap elections at any time within his 5-year cycle, or the power of the Prime Minister to go to war at any time without the consent of Parliament. Last year we also witnessed a shift of power within government away from the Prime Minister to his deputy in the form of the first post-war coalition government between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. Let me just address some of these points in some more detail. The shift from centre to the periphery in the form of devolution happened in 1998. Scotland and Northern Ireland were both granted legislative and executive powers, particularly in the areas of health, education and public service. A reduced package with only devolved executive powers was adopted for Wales. We have since seen 3 elections to the Scottish Parliament, paving the way for 2 Scottish coalition governments between Labour and the Liberal Democrats in 1998 and 2003, and 1 minority government held by the Scottish National Party in 2007. The Scottish Parliament has just been formally dissolved for the 4th round of elections to take place on 5 May in a few days' time. The situation in Northern Ireland is, as usual, a little more complicated and beyond the scope of my presentation. Some of you, as Mark Donfrid has announced, will attend a lecture by Professor Paul Carmichael at the Centre for British Studies tomorrow, I think at 12:45, and he will tell you more about devolution in Northern Ireland, straight from the horse's mouth. He's Dean of the Faculty at the University of Ulster. It's safe to say, though, that the Scottish Parliament and Government have firmly established themselves as regional institutions, and all major political parties would rather shift more power from Westminster to Holyrood, the seat of the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh, than the other way round. The Scottish National Party, of course, striving for independence, but Labour, Liberal Democrats and Conservatives even agree that if anything needs to be changed, it needs to be entrenchment, and it needs to be more powers in the hands of the Scottish Parliament and Government. The debate does therefore not focus on whether the Scottish devolution has been a success, but rather how one can build on this success by deepening, possibly, as I mentioned, entrenching devolution. And we'll return to this issue in a moment. The other next shift from government I mentioned was to the people by the way of form of referenda. They do not fit. Referenda do not fit into the landscape of Mr. Potsnap and the old constitution. And nothing in UK constitutional law practice would require a government to ask the entire electorate to decide on a specific political issue or even consult the electorate about a specific political issue. Nevertheless, referenda have increasingly been used for political reasons. They have been promised in election manifestos in order to gain the votes of those who are skeptical towards shifting power away from central government. That's been the main function of referenda so far. So referenda were promised and held before devolution in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, ensuring that only such shifts of power to the regions would be made which would be approved by a majority in the region concerned. Referenda have been held or promised on the issue of shifting power from the UK government to European Union institutions. Labour promised a referendum before the United Kingdom would join the Eurozone, which the Labour government then did not propose at any rate. And the Tories in the last election promised a referendum on any further shift of power to the European Union. Any further shift of power to the European Union. More recently, however, a referendum has been used for a different constitutional issue on which the present coalition government is deeply divided, namely a change in the electoral system. The present system of first past the post means that all members of the House of Commons are elected in constituencies, and the candidate with the largest number of votes wins the seat. So you can easily win your seat with 30% share of the total votes. If your closest rival only has 29%, you take the seat. This means that usually, although not presently, the party which gains 35 to 40% has won the election. This usually meant that New Labour, with which has won 3 general elections, all 3 of them with very, very comfortable majorities, did so on anything between 33 and 40%. Unsurprisingly, the Liberal Democrats, who last polled 21% of the popular vote, but who have less than 9% of the seats, favour a different model. The different model which they have proposed is not proportional representation, as it is done in Germany and many other countries, whereby political parties are represented in the parliament according to the share they take in the total vote. They favour a model whereby voters on election day will express a second or third preference. So if no candidate has a 50%, wins more than half of the votes outright, then other candidates with less votes drop out, and their second and third votes are counted up until somebody finally reaches 50%. And the Liberals thought so far that they would be in a good position to gain from this system, as Labour candidates might rather vote for Liberals than for Conservatives, and Conservative candidates might rather vote for Liberals than for Labour. The Conservatives are, just as naturally as the Liberal Democrats favour this model, they're against it. And however, it was obvious that the Liberal Democrats would not join a government. That was the first chance for them ever to have a change. So the compromise was, let the people decide in a referendum. And this referendum would decide if the majority would be in favour of changing the electoral system, then it will be introduced. If the majority was against it, then the first past the post system would prevail. And this referendum, well, let me just detail the position of Labour. Labour used to be strongly supportive of first past the post in the past, as the other major party, which always had gained from that. Had many second thoughts when it started to look less likely that Labour would win another comfortable majority this way. Currently, again, unsurprisingly, more Labour supporters have been voicing their preference for the existing system. This referendum is also scheduled, like the Scottish Parliament election, for 5 May. The outcome is very unclear. It looked like it was a head-to-head race. Then it looked like the referendum would fail and people would prefer first past the post. At the moment, the last polls say it's clearly an open race, and we'll see. Surprising, perhaps, from a continental European perspective. How could anybody not prefer proportional representation? Well, I've mentioned you 3 reasons why many British people think they're actually, although it is slightly undemocratic in the sense that many votes are lost, there are advantages: clear responsibilities, clear accountability, strong governments. Let's come back to the general issue of referenda. There is no obligation for referenda at all. And still Bogner believes that they have altered the constitutional landscape in the sense that for certain central issues, promising and holding political referenda has become a political must, something which parties cannot afford to do without, regardless of whether it's the Conservative Party, the Liberals, or Labour Party. Let's move to the next shift, from Parliament to the Judiciary, from Parliament to the courts. This did, to be precise, not start in 1997, but when the United Kingdom joined the European Economic Community, as it was then called, in the early 70s. A condition of joining was that the United Kingdom would accept the supremacy of the existing European Community's law over national law. And since then, the courts in the United Kingdom have been doing something they would never have dreamed of doing, at least not since the Glorious Revolution, to do, namely to scrutinize acts of Parliament for their conformity with superior law. And they are in the position to say there is a UK Act of Parliament passed by House of Commons and the House of Lords and given assent by the Queen, and it is no law because it's not in conformity with European Union law. So in this sense, they can almost, in the fashion of a constitutional court, act and declare invalid UK Acts of Parliament. The power of the courts has been increased with the Human Rights Act, which was enacted in 1998. This implements the much earlier European Convention on Human Rights into UK law, and the courts are now allowed to scrutinize whether existing European United Kingdom law is on all fours with the Human Rights Act and the European Convention on Human Rights. However, unlike many constitutional courts, like the German Federal Constitutional Court, they cannot declare any act which fails to pass this test void. They can simply issue a declaration of incompatibility and just leave it to the political mechanisms putting pressure on government and parliament to make the legislation compatible. The courts have been making use of this power by and large prudently, but nevertheless clearly. I've briefly mentioned before a shift from government to the media in the form of the Freedom of Information Act. That's another piece of labor legislation. It was actually intended to shift power from government to the people, and it has done so. It has introduced a right to know. So individuals can request the government to disclose all kinds of information which concerns them, their local constituency, governmental services, etc. And the government authorities have to respond and provide this information. You can enforce it in a court of law if the government doesn't comply, etc. The majority of these requests, some 60%, are indeed made by private individuals, but it's perhaps the some 20% of requests made by journalists which have done more to affect the political landscape. The media have been given a powerful tool for investigation into governmental activities or failures to act, and it has become increasingly difficult for public bodies to rely on the classical strategy against such requests, which is called stonewalling, and a graphical description for dealing with questions of sort. They have to answer, and this has shifted indeed again power away from the government. Two more shifts of power from government to parliament have been announced, as I said before. The first relating to the power of the Prime Minister to take the United Kingdom to war, which was at last used in 2003 in the case of the Iraq War, or arguably now, if you think that Libya is a war, that would be another example. Being aware of the public mood, which was critical towards the Iraq War in general, although not as critical as the German public mood, and against the Parliament not having been involved in particular, that was also a major stumbling block, Prime Minister Blair at the time called for a debate in the House of Commons, but it was clear to everybody that he would not be bound by any outcome of the debate. So the Parliament could say nay, and the Prime Minister could still say A to a war. Prime Minister Brown announced, when he was still Prime Minister, of course, that his government would introduce a bill which in the future would require consent of the Parliament, but this actually failed to happen during his time in office. Limits perhaps on Parliament time, maybe it wasn't quite so pressing as some other agenda points. The present government, under David Cameron, has announced a bill which would do away with the power of the Prime Minister to call a general election at any time, which he likes, within the 5-year maximum term, for which the House of Commons is elected. This is still in the pipeline, but may eventually be adopted. And this tool, the Prime Minister's power to call a snap election, is a very, very powerful tool, as I mentioned before, against rebelling backbenchers, but also against the opposition. You can't threaten the opposition. You can use, if you are right high in the polls, as Margaret Thatcher did right after the Falklands War, secure another comfortable majority, but you also have a tactical advantage. You know as Prime Minister when you have to fight a general election. As opposition, you don't. You always have to have the money and the logistics to prepare and fight a general election within a space of 6 weeks from the time that the Prime Minister announces. So it is a powerful tool. Another shift may also be in the pipeline. It's a shift from the Commons to the Lords. And that relates to what I would call halfway finished or unfinished business, reform of the House of Lords. When Tony Blair came to power, there were hundreds of parliamentarians in the House of Lords who sat there because their father or uncle had been sitting there, and before them their grandfathers or granduncles or whatever, hereditary peers. Members of the nobility who with their title also had the right to sit in the House of Lords. This has been reduced to 90 members of this House in another wonderful compromise, and they're still sitting there. And both the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats have voiced plans that in the future most members of the House of Lords should be elected. At the moment, they're appointed by the Queen, as it is said, on the advice of the Prime Minister, which one could say as on the instruction of the Prime Minister, only that you don't instruct the Queen. Another powerful tool in the hands of the Prime Minister, doing favors, patronage, should be moving away to the people, that the majority should in future be elected. And there is another sense in which this would shift power away from the government and the House of Lords, House of Commons, which it usually controls with a majority. An elected House of Lords would, namely, presumably no longer be bound by another convention which exists. According to this convention, the House of Lords will not use its delaying power against any legislative proposal which is contained or was contained in the election manifesto of the governing party. The rationale which has always been given for this convention was that the House of Lords has no democratic legitimacy to oppose a bill on which the governing party was elected. And this rationale would certainly not bind an elected House of Lords. So you'd see a real, perhaps fighting second chamber if the appointment procedure is shifted to an election procedure. This was an overview of the many ways in which power has been dissipating away from the Prime Minister and away from the House of Commons to the House of Lords, to the people, to opposition parties. Let's now look briefly at the tools of change and analyze whether they also reveal what I've been calling a constitutionalization of UK politics. The old constitution depended on a balanced mix of three sources of rules. We've already seen that one of them, the conventions, were purely political. They would evolve and develop over time. Instances of the second source of rules have already been mentioned, Acts of Parliament. And under the doctrine of supremacy of Parliament, the legislator is free to enact, amend, repeal, all these with a simple majority, unhampered by any codified constitution. These are legal rules. They can be enforced in the Court of Law. We have not yet mentioned the third source of rules. This is the so-called case law, rules which the courts have developed over decades and centuries when having to decide individual cases. These decisions are what is called binding precedent. So if the same legal question arises in an identical or very similar case, the same rule will again have to be applied. One example is the supremacy of Parliament. How do we know Parliament is supreme? There is no Supremacy of Parliament Act. It's the courts who have said so. The people who have to enforce rules are the courts, and as long as they say Parliament is supreme, Parliament is supreme. So this is another puzzle piece in a very important piece, sometimes underrated piece, in the setup of the old political constitution. During the present phase of constitutionalization of UK politics, one more tool has been added to the list, and there is another one which is being discussed. The last one would be the adoption of a codified constitution, which is being debated, and the former are what I call designer conventions. Normal conventions evolve from political practice. Designer conventions are used deliberately as a tool for rulemaking. The best example is the so-called Sewell Convention. This is a convention which unusually has been made in writing. It is a convention which was made in context of devolution in Scotland. Under the relevant legislation, the Scotland Act 1998, all powers which have been devolved to the Scottish Parliament and government can at any time be called back, either by Parliament in Westminster or even by government in Downing Street. Secretary of State for Scotland has the right to repeal any legislative competence at any time. And for many areas where Scotland has been given powers, these still under the existing unchanged Scotland Act must yield to legislation which has been enacted in Westminster. When discussing the Scotland Bill 1998, which then became the Act, in the House of Lords, the government minister in charge, Lord Sewell, representing the government there in the House of Lords, said the following. I'll read this out to you. Clause 27 makes it clear that the devolution of legislative competence to the Scottish Parliament does not affect the ability of Westminster to legislate for Scotland, even in relation to devolved matters. Indeed, as paragraph 44 of the White Paper explained, we envisaged that there could be instances where it could be more convenient for legislation on devolved matters to be passed by the United Kingdom Parliament. However, as happened in Northern Ireland earlier in the century, would expect the convention to be established that Westminster would not normally legislate with regard to devolved matters in Scotland without the consent of the Scottish Parliament. We would expect a convention to be established that Westminster would not legislate without the consent of the Scottish Parliament. That is the so-called Sewell Convention, named after the person who made the statement. It was used as a deliberate piece of rulemaking. By law, all power would remain in Westminster. Everything can be called back at any time. As a matter of politics, the central government and the Parliament Westminster will not do this. This non-enforceable promise, it's actually not even a promise, it's a rather an explicit anticipation of a convention which would emerge over the time, was used in order to convince the advocates of devolution that the Scottish powers would be real and lasting, and not just made for a sort of a quick win of something. If things turn out badly, however, no convention can prevent the Prime Minister or other ministers or the Parliament from shifting powers back to the centre. They can do that. And there's nothing which the Scottish Parliament or government can do as a matter of law. In normal circumstances, however, political pressures would prevent the central government from doing that because they would lose the next election in Scotland and possibly also in Westminster. Designer conventions are a very British tool of change because they leave the traditional cornerstone of the UK Constitution, the supremacy of Parliament, seemingly untouched. That leads me to the last sort of point on my agenda here. A codified constitution, ? Will the United Kingdom in the near future join the vast majority of countries who have a codified constitution? In the past, support for a codified constitution among the established political parties could only be found within the Liberal Democrats. And they did not give this any particularly prominent position in their election manifesto because it was not a vote winner. We now, however, witness a broad debate in which this proposition has gained serious support from a much wider range of politicians, academics and journalists. It should be added, though, that it remains rather unlikely that the United Kingdom will adopt a codified constitution in the near future. The shift we presently witness is therefore principally on the discursive side. There is now a debate, and the debate seems to persist. This is a debate, therefore, about the tool number 5, which adopted would outflank the other 4 tools as a codified constitution. Many, including Vernon Bogdanor, believe that a codified constitution would almost necessarily abolish the supremacy of Parliament by finding fixed rules under which parliaments can change the constitution, which might be more severe than what has to be done now, which is actually nothing. I do not agree. I think the modern British way of having a constitution would be to adopt this as any other act of Parliament and add a designer convention similar to the Sewell Convention, namely that it will be only changed in consultation and by consent with the opposition, but only as a convention, not as a matter of law. And in other words, it would look as if the supremacy of Parliament remained intact. It would look as if politics continued to dominate the constitutional landscape rather than the other way around. But that is just my little piece of speculation. Goodbye to Mr. Potsnap. Hello to what? Mr. Potsnap's days are gone for good, and politics no longer dominate the constitutional landscape in the United Kingdom the way they used to. But will this road necessarily lead to the UK resembling Germany as a country of power sharing within government, between coalition partners, power sharing between centre and regions, as with the German Länder, true power sharing between 2 houses of Parliament, where for certain legislation the second chamber can veto legislation and require amendments, and power sharing with the Supreme Court, the UK Supreme Court, which would take the role of a constitutional watchdog? I think not. I think it is fair to say that politics in the UK have become constitutionalized by British standards. But from a German viewpoint, it still looks the other way around, as a country with a strong central government and comparatively low constitutional checks and balances on politics. Thank you for your attention.